The text this morning is, if I can get my clicker going, Psalm 63. It's relatively short. We're going to look at the entire psalm. Psalm 63 is 11 verses long. But as Christmas Day draws closer, we come to our third Advent theme, and that third Advent theme is joy. Now, when we think of joy, and I can't speak for you, I can only speak for myself right now, and I assume that some people think like I do, but when the word joy comes to mind, I know for me the first idea that pops into my mind is something involving happiness. And by happiness, I tend to mean the positive feelings that accompany favorable circumstances. When I think joy, I think happiness. And this is interesting because both passages which were read by Wendy this morning in the Advent reflection were associated with trial and hardship. Did you notice that? She's talking about joy, or the passages she read were talking about joy, but they were associated at the same time with trials and hardship. And I'm going to just give you some of the key portions of them now up on the board. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. Did you guys notice that there? And it also says in Romans 5, not only this, but we also exult in tribulations. And so there's joy and there's trial. And what we can see, if we look, is that the Bible often speaks of joy alongside of hardship. I'll give you some more examples of that. This is Colossians 1:24. Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake. 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 4. I am overflowing with joy in all our affliction. Philippians 2:17. But even if I am being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with you all. This is by no means an exhaustive list. I can give you more and more examples of joy being spoken of in the context of suffering and trial. And what does this mean? This means that according to the scriptures, joy is more than happiness. We're not saying that happiness can't be associated with joy, but we're saying joy is more than happiness. And happiness, what I mean is by this, is that happiness is dependent upon our circumstances. We're happy when things are going well, but not so much when things are going poorly. Joy, on the other hand, transcends our circumstances, and this is why the great saints of old were joyous even in the midst of hardship and suffering, as we saw in the text that we just read. And so happiness is a feeling based upon our present situation, but joy is a choice, and it is a choice made in faith regardless of how things are going in the moment, right? You follow me? Joy is a choice. It's something we will to do. It's something we choose to do. And now with this clarified, I want to spend the rest of our time together this morning unpacking how this choice to be joyful is made and kind of what it means. And we're going to do this by looking at one of the Psalms of David. That is Psalm 63, verses 1 through 11. Follow along with me as I read. It says in verse 1, O God, you are my God. I shall seek you earnestly. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh yearns for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. Thus I have seen you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory. Because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips will praise you. I will bless you as long as I live. I will lift up my hands in your name. My soul is satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth offers praises with joyful lips. When I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches, for you have been my help. And in the shadow of your wings, I sing for joy. My soul clings to you. Your right hand upholds me. But those who seek my life to destroy it will go down into the depths of the earth. They will be delivered over to the power of the sword. They will be prey for the foxes. But the king will rejoice in God. Everyone who swears by him will glory, for the mouths of those who speak lies will be stopped. Now, in the caption, this is not something that I read, but if you have the text in front of you, in the caption above verse 1, it identifies this as a Psalm of David when he was in flight in the wilderness of Judea. Do you see it there? This opens up the possibility of two periods in life that this text is covering. One would be David's flight from Saul before he was king, and the other would be David's flight from Absalom while he was king, more towards the latter portion of his reign. Both positions have their support, but in my opinion, this is just an opinion here, but I think there's valid reason to believe that the greater weight leans towards David's flight from Absalom. I think that one of the reasons to lean that way might be verse 11, where it says, I'm not going to put it up on the board, but if you look in verse 11, he says, the king will rejoice in God. David seems to be speaking of himself as a king, and he was not yet a king when he was fleeing from Saul. It's kind of hard to see him describing himself that way. And with this in mind, regardless of whether it was before or after, David penned Psalm 63 in one of the most trying periods of his life. We can say that for certain. There was never a period in David's life when he was so greatly betrayed and humiliated. I'm going to lean towards Absalom when I say these things. In this period, David's own son, Absalom, conspired against him to steal his throne. He had lost everything. He was fleeing for his life. He was a fugitive from his own kingdom. Again, his own loved ones, his own closest friends were turning on him. This was a terrible period in his life where he was betrayed and humiliated. And I'm saying this so we can put ourselves in David's shoes just for a minute. If you were in the midst of even half as much hardship and despair as David was experiencing in that moment, and you were putting your thoughts to paper, what would you write down? Would you write things down like praise? Or would you say something more along the line of, why is this happening to me, O Lord? What did I do to deserve this, O Lord? Deliver me from my enemies, O Lord. Destroy them, destroy them. It's hard to imagine what we might put down on paper if we were writing these things. But that doesn't appear to be the tone of this psalm, is it? It's not. On the contrary, in the midst of this terrible scene, David conveys great satisfaction with expressions of joy and praise. And we see it in verse 5, most particularly, where he says, my soul is satisfied as with marrow and fatness. And by marrow and fatness, David was saying that he was not just satisfied, but he was living large. He was describing himself as living large. And as a result, he said in the latter portion of verse 5, my mouth offers praises with joyful lips. He was praising from a heart filled with joy in that moment of hardship and despair. Now, how is it that David could experience such fullness and such satisfaction in the midst of such tremendous hardship? And the answer is that David chose to be joyful. And this choice to be joyful gave way eventually to genuine feelings of satisfaction and heartfelt expressions of praise to God, even though he was in the midst of great trial. Again, he chose to be joyful, and that choice gave way to genuine feelings of satisfaction and heartfelt praise over time. The text shows David's joy unfolding in three distinct actions, and we're going to discuss those briefly as points this morning. These three actions are that David thought about God, he saw God, and he praised God. Again, thinking, seeing, and praising. First, thinking. The first action David took was to think about God. And we see this action in verse 6. I'm going to give you just a second to write that down. I see pens scribbling, so we'll just give you a second there. But the first action David took was to think about God, and we see it in verse 6, where it says, and I quote, when I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches. When I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches. Now, arguably, this first action is the most practical of the three. Of all three that we're going to discuss, I would again argue this is the most practical. It's the most intentional of them. It is where, more than any others, we choose to be joyful despite how we feel in the moment. This is the action where we take and we make a willful choice, more so than any other. The other two actions happen more naturally on their own as a result of this first one, and we'll see that as we go along. This is why, when the text speaks of thinking of God, it speaks of more than just a passive reflection or passive recollection of God and his blessings. It rather gives the impression of an active effort to concentrate on these things. And we see that especially in the latter portion of verse 6, where it says, I meditate on you in the night watches. In other words, I'm actively concentrating on you while others are sleeping. I'm rallying my energy to focus upon you at all times. Even when other people are not paying attention, I'm focusing upon you. You guys see it there. He's meditating in the night watches. And when I look at this passage of Scripture, and you may see different things, but what comes to my mind is Fred Rogers. Anybody a fan of Mr. Rogers? Yeah. I was raised up. There was Mr. Rogers, and then there was Sesame Street. And this is back before there were streaming services and stuff like that, and you had to be in front of the TV at the time it was broadcasting to catch the show. Mr. Rogers was a main he was a main character that was on every morning, and I can't think of anyone in modern history who was more universally recognized and admired for his genuine Christ-likeness. I don't think I'm overstating this. Everyone who saw him admired him. And everyone who met him in person was always amazed to find that he really was as warm and as kind and as thoughtful and as selfless as he appeared on TV. You know, when he was on TV, he spoke in that really gentle, kind, slow voice, like he was just so warm and kind. People who talked to him said, that's actually the way he was. It wasn't his TV face. He really was like that. In fact, he was so much like that he was hard to interview. People would try to ask him questions about himself, and he wouldn't answer. Instead, he would ask questions, how are you doing? Tell me about you. He didn't want to talk about himself. He kept wanting to talk about them. And it was very frustrating, I guess, to try to interview him because of that. And it wasn't that he was doing it intentionally. He just had no interest in talking about himself. And he was also notoriously hard to work with because they'd have a schedule, and they'd try to get the productions done, and some random person would walk in front of him, and he'd see him and light up and want to hear about their lives and talk about them. It'd be somebody that no one knew, but he had this way of just elevating everyone and caring about everyone, and it was hard to keep him focused on the task because he cared so much about other people. In fact, he had this habit of wanting to take pictures of them and almost treating common people like they were famous. It was a very interesting thing to see him. But the reason I share all this is to say, those who have read anything about him know that this wasn't an accident. It didn't happen on its own, all right? He had a very rigorous habit of daily meditation and reflection that began very early in the morning and lasted for hours each day. Did you know that? You know, how did this guy get into this frame of mind where he could behave in such a Christ-like way? Well, he got up very early in the morning, and he focused very intently. He meditated very intently. He rose early. He thought deeply about God while everyone else was still sleeping. Does that sound very familiar? You know, he thought about God during the night watches. And this practice was so essential to him that he would encourage everyone to meditate whenever he spoke to people or when he spoke publicly. At one point, when he received the Lifetime Achievement Award, it was like an Oscars ceremony where all the big actors were there. He got up there on the platform, and he reminded them that he got to where he was because of people that helped him along the way. And he says, would everyone just stop for a minute and just take a few seconds and think about someone who helped you get to where you are? And then he said, I'll keep track of the time. Let's just take 10, 15 seconds and do that. You know, that's the way this guy was. He was always telling them, stop and think about your blessings. Stop and think about them all the time. It was really, really interesting to see. Those who practice Christian joy that transcends all circumstances do so because they take time to stop and to think about what really matters. Does that make sense? That's what they do. And they are able to get their minds off of themselves and off of their worldly problems, and they're able, again, to think about God and his blessings. They're able to think about their blessings and their hope, which never change despite what happens in this world. And the question is, why is this so important? Why is this so necessary? Why do we need to meditate in the night watches? Why do we need to put so much effort into concentrating on all of these things, all of God's blessings? The answer is that it is our fallen human tendency to fixate upon what we don't have rather than what we do have. Would you believe me if I told you that? That when we let our minds do their own thing, they tend to fixate on what we don't have rather than what we do have. When we take our hands off the wheel of our minds, the natural inclination is to focus upon our wants rather than upon our blessings. Why is it that we're so unhappy sometimes? Why is it that we can be so gloomy? It's because we're focusing upon our wants and forgetting about our blessings. When I was young, I don't know if you guys had this experience, and I say when I was young, I know some of you still think that I am young, but when I was younger, I dreamed of having the things that I have now. I remember thinking to myself, if I just made this income, I would never want anything ever again. If I would just achieve this, I would never want anything else. I remember how bad I wanted to get into pastoral ministry. It took me 5 years to get into ministry. And I remember those 5 years felt like an eternity to me. And I was like, this is never, if I could just get there, I would be so much happier. And now I have all of those things, and then some, and I still get gloomy from time to time. Why? Because my fallen mind still gravitates towards my wants and away from my blessings. If you ever look at Holly and wonder why she's so happy all the time, it's because she's always fixated upon her blessings. Sorry about that. Sorry. Moving on. True Christian joy that we see in the text begins when we break this negative cycle. It begins when we take control of our minds and we focus them upon our blessings. All right, does that make sense? That's what we mean by thinking about God. But it doesn't stop there. I would argue that's the most intentional of them, though. That's where you really take your brain and you really focus on where it needs to go. But the second action we see in this text is to see God. All right? We see it in verse 2. David saw God. He talks about it in verse 2. I'll give you just another second. He says in verse 2, "Thus I have seen you in the sanctuary, to see your power and your glory." Now, as we've already seen, when we let our minds run free, they tend to focus on our wants rather than on our blessings. And the natural result of this is to become blind to all of the wonderful things that God has already placed in front of us. And this is how we can look into a closet full of clothes and complain that we have nothing to wear. This is how we can look into a refrigerator full of food and say there's nothing to eat. This is how we can stream. How many streaming services do I have now? I have like 5 or 6 of them. And, this is how we can come across endless channels and say there's nothing on, there's nothing to watch. However, when we take control of our minds and begin to focus them upon God's blessings, the opposite begins to happen. We start to see the blessings that were there all along that we'd totally forgotten about. Does that make sense? When we take our hands off the wheel, we forget our blessings and we don't even see that stuff. But when we get them reoriented on our blessings, we start to see them. They start popping up and we're like, that was there all along. I forgot all about it. There's a number of ways that we can see this happening in the world around us. One of them is that it's a funny thing that happens, but people who put their houses for sale, oftentimes, it isn't often, but this happens more than you might realize. They'll put their house on the market, and then they'll change their mind and not want to sell it anymore. You ever hear that kind of thing happening? Why do people do stuff like that? It's because they get bored of their house. They've been in it forever. They're bored of it. They empty it out. They list it. And then a realtor comes in, and they take pictures of it, and they present it in all of its blessings and benefits. And then the owners look at it and go, my house is pretty nice. And then they change their mind, This is something that happens. But I think probably a better example of this would be funerals. It's a sadder example, but it's a better example. People will go for decades sometimes, ignoring their parents, ignoring their grandparents, extended family, etc. And sometimes they'll do this out of active grievances held against them. Other times it's mere indifference. But regardless, at a funeral, we have this custom, whether we intend to or not, to stop and reflect upon a person's life. And in the process, we will inevitably hear testimony about how this person made a difference here or there. And inevitably, we'll be reminded of positive experiences that we had with them that were forgotten. And as this happens, the hearts begin to warm up. And the tears begin to flow. And people who hadn't thought about this family member for years start to miss them and appreciate them. But by then it's too late. There's nothing more you can do. They're gone. Granted, there's life on the other side, but there was so much opportunity that was missed because no thought or effort was put into this while they were still alive. This comes up to me in particular because I think about my own grandmother, who I officiated her funeral a few years ago. I didn't have a strained relationship with her at all, but I was never close to her. And I hadn't seen her for quite a while before she passed away. She passed away during COVID, so she was actually sequestered anyway. It would have been hard to see her. But I hadn't been going to see her, to be honest with you, all that much before all that happened. And then she passed away in a nursing home. Hadn't seen her in a long time. And I can remember, as I was asked to present at her funeral and to officiate and do the eulogy, I remember thinking to myself that it was going to be very challenging to talk about her because there really wasn't, at the first thought, much to say about her. But when I stopped and just started thinking about it a little bit, I began to remember all kinds of things that she had done and that she had said, and things about her demeanor and character that I had completely forgotten. I remembered how reliable she was. I remembered how generous she was. I can remember specific instances where she was there for me, such things as that. And if I had done this when she was still alive, I would have most surely gone and communicated more appreciation to her, but I'd forgotten all about it, you know. And I mean, I say this with embarrassment and shame, not, just to be honest with you. And we all do stuff like this. We forget it. As we focus our minds on God and His blessings, we will naturally begin to see the world around us differently. And that's what happened with David. David, even though he was in the midst of a very, very difficult situation, he was able to express incredible amounts of joy and satisfaction in spite of it, because he was able to see the blessings of God in His kingdom that no one else was seeing. He was able to look back and see all the ways that God came through for him before, and know in faith that He was going to come through for him now, and know that there was nothing but a bright future ahead for him because God was on His throne and nothing would change that. And we've talked about this before as well, but as we talked about this 2 weeks ago when we were talking about hope. There's something about living with the Lord and walking with Him month after month and year after year where you really get more established in that because you've had a few years of God coming through for you to know that whatever it is in front of you now, He's gonna take care of it there too, because He did the last 1,000 times I was in a pinch, right? When you think about those things, joy sets in, and you start to see the blessings that are there. They start to materialize. Stuff that you forgot comes back to the forefront again. So first you think about God, and then you see His hand at work all around. And that brings us to the final action that we see in the text, okay? And that is praise. David also praised God. We see his praise most of all. This is the thing that takes place more than anything else. We see it in verses 3 through 5, also in verse 7, where it says, "Because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live. I will lift my hands in your name. My soul is satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth offers praises with joyful lips." Also in verse 7, it says, "For you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy." There's a lot of expression of praise in this psalm, but underlying it is the effort of thinking about the blessings and then being able to see it. And this is the heart responding to what's underlying. Okay? David's praise is the natural response to the blessings of God that he was thinking and that he was seeing. With that in mind, the truest praise to God is that which naturally flows from a heart that is satisfied in Him. You don't have to tell a person who is already overflowing with satisfaction to express themselves with praise. People that are in this state do it naturally. You don't have to stand in front of them and say, "Oh, you guys really look kind of somber. You guys need to praise." That's not the way it works when someone is overflowing. It just comes out naturally. It flows naturally like praise does, or like excitement does at a Bills game or a Sabres game, which, by the way, very well could happen. Do you anticipate some shouting to happen today? I mean, I'm sure it was 2 weeks ago when they were playing San Francisco. But you don't have to tell people that they should be praising God when they are already seeing His blessings. Those with no praise to offer, those who are somber and sour and depressed and frustrated, have given no thought to him. And for this reason, they see nothing to be thankful for. And this doesn't mean that they can't turn it around. It just means that they're in a state where they're not seeing the blessings. The Bible teaches that what's in your heart flows from your mouth naturally. Did you know that? It teaches that what's in your heart flows from your mouth. And this is Matthew 12:34 through 35. For the mouth speaks out of that which fills the heart. The good man brings out of his good treasure what is good, and the evil man brings out of his evil treasure what is evil. That is the scripture. Sometimes a folksy way of putting it can sometimes people have a way of summarizing things in a folksy way, and there's this old preacher named Vance Havner who took this same concept and put it this way. What's down in the well comes up in the bucket. What's down in the well comes up in the bucket. Makes sense, and it's true. What's in here comes out. With this in mind, what's coming out of your mouth these days? Does the well of your heart overflow with praise or with complaint? If you are finding yourself down and sour and grumbling, it might be time to get back to step one and actively start steering your mind towards God and his blessings. Because joy is a choice. It is not a feeling based upon the ever-changing circumstances in life. It is a willful decision that we make in faith based upon all the blessings of the kingdom of God, both present and future. Are you unhappy today? If yes, ask yourself why that is. Depression is a very real thing. I understand that. On my side of the family, it runs on my side of the family, especially on my mother's side. My grandmother had it. My mother's brothers had it. I know that I feel it, and I even see myself passing it on to my kids a little bit. It is a very real thing, and I'm not saying that there isn't times for treatment for it as well. It's a very real thing. But the best medicine for depression is to stop and think about God and his blessings and to choose to be joyful. I'm not saying it's easy, but I am saying that is actually where it starts, and that's the best thing you can do. There are times where I get overrun by the stuff that's going on in my life. I have nothing different going on in my life than all of you do. You guys have your burdens just like I have mine. But there are times, especially when I'm out at work, where my coworkers will say, Dan, you all right? You look down, you look sad, you look upset. And to be honest with you, I can, if I take personal inventory, I can be honest with myself and say, you know what? I've been focused upon myself a lot. I've been self-centered. I've been focused more upon my troubles and on my blessings, and now it's starting to reflect. Now I'm walking around like a sourpuss, and everyone else is seeing it too. You know, a big part of our witness is to be able to find our joy and radiate that. How are we supposed to be able to represent the kingdom of God when we look like we're losing? Okay? This is really important. So joy is a choice. It is a choice. It is something that we have the power to make every day. Our circumstances don't remove our ability to be joyous, even when things are going south. And we see that in the scriptures, in the worst of circumstances. I'm getting sick, sorry. In the worst of circumstances, people can choose to be joyful and radiate incredible joy. And honestly, it's in those times of deep difficulty that when we radiate joy, we communicate the most to the world about the kingdom of God. So my prayer is that we'll be able to do that in this time. Help us to find our joy, help us to choose joy, and help us to reflect that. Will you pray with me at this time?